Ohio, and then it'll be there until January, and then it'll actually move up to the History Center up here in Fort Wayne, and it'll be here for 6 months, and then it'll go out to Oklahoma, and then it will go back to the Ohio History Center in Columbus, Ohio. So these are flyers for our kickoff event on the 4th and the 5th. We'll have speakers, Nicole Allagood, who's a citizen of the Delaware Nation, and Diane Hunter, who is a citizen of the Miami Tribe of Oklahoma. So if anybody wants any of these flyers, feel free to take some. Okay. And then just because I have a backlog of stuff that I've printed off for other presentations, I have handouts here. People are interested in taking any of these posters, articles, chapters from other things. They're not necessarily directly related to what I came here to talk about today, but I can talk about those if we run out of errors to discuss. The main thing that I'm here to discuss is many people probably heard a little over a year ago about the supposed comet that exploded over Cincinnati, Ohio, and supposedly spurred mound building among the Hopewell, but also ended the Hopewell culture. It did both of those things somehow. And the supposed evidence for that airburst was buried in some cases under meters of artificial construction of these earthen monuments. And so that right there raised a bunch of issues for me when I first started looking at it. And we got together a group of, it ended up being 12 scholars to take a really close look at the article and the supplemental material and the supporting citations to see what exactly it was that Tankersley and his colleagues were attempting to say was representing a cosmic airburst. So we did, I have a PowerPoint here. If there's no questions or anything, that's my fallback. I will just go through that and revive what we did as a presentation at the spring 2022 Ohio Archaeological Council meeting. But one thing that I wanted to try out here is to kind of have a more iterative, interactive approach, especially with those in person here, going through the original article and trying to figure out how to analyze and critique and break down these things that on the surface, it's presented, it's very slick, it seems to all go together, and then you just start poking at some of those details and things start to unravel very quickly. And one of the things that I discovered in the process of working with other scholars, we particularly were working with Dr. Tim McCoy, who is the curator of meteorites for the Smithsonian. And he's done some other work on archaeological deposits. He's looked at sourcing meteoric iron that was used by Hopewell to make ornaments that were found in some of these mounds, and sourcing that back to the actual impact that did happen that was known about before. So I knew by the time we ended up getting Dr. McCoy on the team, I knew that the archaeology didn't add up, but I didn't have any, it's not my area of specialty. And the kinds of errors that we found go into that analysis and the interpretation of that analysis as well. This is kind of an example of how science can go wrong, and simultaneously that science is actually a functional, if imperfect, way of trying to understand a particular topic. And so because it was published and it was open access, and we could look at the information and we could re-examine it and examine the assumptions that they made, we were able to at least partially correct the record. Of course, it took a long time to get to that point, not least of which was because of the editorial process at the journal that originally published it. and then was pressured into retracting the article. But it took time to dig into. It was a fairly time-consuming endeavor, and that's probably why most of us have never seen another archaeology article, at least not in the Midwest, retracted. I'm not aware of any. You guys are aware? So it's not a very common thing to have it completely retracted, but debate back and forth happens fairly regularly. So did any of you guys read the paper or look over the papers? Okay. Let me see. I don't know if I can see that on there. Not really well. Well, I'm not logged into the Zoom on this computer. Get my. There we go. There. Sorry about that. Anybody have any questions so far?
Some point, like to hear how we're able to keep this.
Yeah, it was definitely not easy, and there was a lot of resistance. And especially since this is public, I probably should be careful with what I say, since I signed a publishing agreement that I wouldn't talk about the review process. But there was early on our initial draft that we submitted, they refused to send it out for review at first because the corresponding author was not identified and didn't have, and their contact information was not identified on the cover page. All 12 of us had our email on the cover page, and I was clearly identified in the system as the corresponding author, and anything the reviewers would have gotten would have listed me as the corresponding author. So I had to go back and take it down and add an asterisk and then add corresponding author at the bottom of the title page. And then they said, oh, well, you used one of the figures from the original article. You need to get their permission to do that and make sure that you have copyright permission to do that. This is an open access journal. The entire thing, it's mandatory. It won't go out for review unless you agree that it's open access and you pay your open access fee. And so there was no copyright restriction on anything in that. I mean, I could have copied and pasted the entire article and posted it on my website, and they couldn't have done anything about it. And so there is no copyright. And they said, oh, we will not send it out for review or even complete the quality check until you get permission to use that figure. So we had to figure out a different way to show the same example. And so we did. It was lots of little things like that. So we submitted the first draft in July of 2022. It didn't go out for a review until December 5th. And that was like 4 or 5 rounds of back and forth with the editors about whether or not it was fit their guidelines, whether or not it was appropriate, timely, important enough, challenging the original conclusions or advancing the discussion. And it seemed the whole time, it seemed to me like we were being set up for getting through review and then getting rejected, as he kept quoting the guidelines, all these things, and saying, we don't think it meets this. And we can have different opinions as to what contributes to the conversation. So that's not a really useful criteria. But eventually it came back, and it was like it under review for like 200 days, just over 200 days, and they finally came back that it was accepted and that they had rejected the response by the original authors because it didn't really do anything. But well, where's my Yes, but we felt it was important to get it into the same venue that did, and we went there first because we did want to try to get them to retract it. And so initially, my initial discussions with the editor were, we don't have to publish this, but these are all the reasons why this shouldn't have been published in the first place. So we were really trying to get them to see it was a mistake and to correct the mistake. And eventually they did. Now, if you download the article, it now says retracted article on there. For some reason, my Zoom did not start. I'll click on the link again.
What are you first looking at when you find an article that you're skeptical about?
Well, that's a oh no, there it is. That's a really good question. I mean, I initially was skeptical. I've had issues with the veracity of other things that Tankersley has published. And there have been several other articles where he makes weird claims that nobody else has. All right, can you still hear me on there? All right. Now let's see if I can share my screen. This one. All right. Okay. So the first thing that you might look at is in one of the other articles that I had issues with a while back is the figures. Go look at the figures and see what it is. And that's one thing that, if there's anything that, oh, no, I'm getting confused by the screens here, look for what are the scales on the, I mean, a lot of figures that he's published in other articles don't have scales on both axes of a graph. So you don't know what they are. Two lines that make the same shape, but it's not telling you what that y-axis is on the graph. And so I don't know. What is the magnitude of those curves? What's the error bar? I don't know. And you can also look at how they're starting their ramp up of the article. And one of the things that, at least that I notice in a lot of these questionable papers, is that they have a long ramp up, and they say banal, unobjectionable thing, build on that, build on that, build on that, and then they jump to, oh, here's a conclusion that it's not relevant to anything that I've mentioned before, but the structure of the writing makes it seem that this comes from that. So that's not your field of expertise. If you're not familiar with those sources already, it follows a pattern. It fits. That's how we expect the narrative to flow. And so they build up and sometimes throwing out some like really, really detailed, sometimes really obscure things that don't necessarily seem to matter, which make it seem like there's a depth of understanding of the phenomenon that they're talking about. But if it seems strange, or if the beginning of the paragraph doesn't seem to connect to the end of the paragraph, go to those sources. What is he actually citing? And that's one of the things, with these quote unquote hard science journals, most of them use footnote citations, right? So you can't even see, as you're reading the paper, what familiar names and sources they're actually using, unless you're flipping back and forth to the back end. One of the things that we see here is, I don't remember exactly what the statement is, but he says something, a sweeping statement about organization of Hopewell society. And what do they cite? It's an introductory archaeology textbook. It's not any primary or even secondary scholarly sources. It's images of the past by Price and Feynman that some of you may have actually read in Archaeology 100 or whatever class that is here. You don't do that in a scholarly source. I mean, if that's not, you haven't read all the sources, what do? You go to that and you see what they're referencing, and then you consult those, and then you build up your understanding so that you can cite those sources that actually are relevant. And so they sprinkle little things like that in there, and to make it seem like there is this building momentum, and then there's a gap, and then they say something. And so another thing is, you can, I mean, and this is a sticky part in a lot of literature reviews, is saying how much is enough? Does it have to be comprehensive? Do you have to cite the most well-known source of this? Do you have to cite this particular individual? We can't do it. You can't do everything in an article, especially when in this format, there's word limits and reference number limits in the guidelines. And so you have to be selective with that. But if you're going through and they're talking about things and they cite, you're familiar with the topic, and they cite obscure sources that you're not familiar with, or most of the relevant sources that you're aware of aren't there. And again, that's difficult when you have the footnote site or the endnote citations. Then something isn't matching up. So as you're starting to get into it, I mean, they're laying out the framework for it, how they're framing it out. Look for gaps in the logical chain. So they build up and sometimes throw out random obscure details to kind of wow you, and then you just go right along with it. It flows into the next one. Oops, sorry, I'm getting where am I at? And so, in that, just in the first couple of pages describing what Hopewell is, there are some issues. One of the things that keeps their argument is they say that there's this social decline in Hopewell, but they don't cite anybody who says that. They don't build that argument themselves. They just claim that it's really obvious they were building mounds and then they weren't. So that's a social decline. And so we need to explain that. And then citing absolutely no one who has ever addressed that in the last 100 years. They don't cite any of those. I mean, do we know exactly what happened to cause the mound building to stop around 400 AD? Not necessarily. There are lots of different ideas, but none of those ideas are discussed. He just puts it in there as a well-known assumption that there was a social decline that needs to be explained. And so you can make measurements and interpretations without necessarily having a reason why you're trying to find something in that location. But they frame it as, well, there's this obvious social decline. So then we need to look there to find at this time to find something that caused it. And then they go into detail about, oh, well, there were 69 near-Earth objects that were observed in Chinese records during the Hopewell period, and that seems to be a big spike in the number of near-Earth objects. Okay, irrelevant. It doesn't say anything about the Chinese observing a comet that was coming right for the ball of rock that they're spinning through space on and just disappearing after it would have hit them, because they could have seen it in the sky if it was there, and they didn't see it in the sky. So why is that? And then another thing that they do in this particular case is, and before I say this, I want to preface it with, yes, there are successful cases of working with indigenous peoples and their stories and finding things, matching them to the archaeological record. Doesn't mean that every time someone brings it up, it is true. And so he then says, and I'm going to intentionally avoid any further discussion of this, but says, well, I'm a Native American, and these Native American stories that I know of say that there was a comet that they observed, and so therefore there was a comet, and it's just another thing that supports the overall argument that there was a comet. But none of those stories mention a comet. There have been responses from some of the tribes whose stories they use saying, no, that's not actually what that's about. And so he's throwing a lot of things out there and scheming like it's all coming together. But you just got to start picking at the details. So even if you come into a paper where you're expecting to agree with them, you should still be looking for these kinds of things. You need to evaluate whether or not they are building that. You can't just read it, get to the conclusion and say, oh, okay, well, that's what happened. That's not how any of this works. And we can't even do that with your friends and other people in your research group. You need to be prepared to dissect everything. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, that didn't happen when this was submitted, and that was actually the job of the peer reviewers, was to get into it and dissect it. This came through here and go through the article for those who haven't seen it. This is the region that they're talking about. Those are the sites that they claim to have samples from. They did in their supplemental material, they put in coordinates for where all their samples came from. That will come up later. And then they present these for each of the sites. They have a picture of a soil profile, tracings of the supposed layers that they're seeing in there. And then they've got sometimes specific spots labeled to have charcoal on them. These white dots are where they say they took soil samplers from. And then they usually show something like this that shows the context within the site. So this is a reconstructed version of what the Turner earthworks would have looked like when they were in active use. They say that their sample comes from there. I still don't know where their sample came from. And then there's another thing here is that, and this, we didn't mention this in our analysis, but when I saw these maps, I recognized them. They're from an MA thesis out of the University of Cincinnati. The person who did that analysis is not a co-author on this paper. The person who made those maps and has them in their thesis is not credited in the captions. And so that, again, was another red flag for me, is that this is work from one of the graduate students that worked there that he's not crediting or citing appropriately. And I don't know. Maybe they didn't want to be involved in this, but they should still have been credited. So it's a bunch of these little tiny things that are adding up. Another thing, and this is weird, it's how many of you guys have been on an archaeological excavation or seen pictures of a real archaeological excavation, seeing the photos that come out of that, how you set those photos up to document what's going on? You have clear, you have even lighting, you eliminate the shadows as much as you can, you get multiple pictures of each exposure with different light balances so that you're catching the differences in the soil color. You have to be real careful with how you're setting these up so that what you're seeing with your unaided eye comes through in the documents. And so we've got what appear to be sometimes candid photos of soil profiles with, there's no scale in the picture. It's been cropped out. And so, I mean, that for the format, that's okay, but they've got their scales on the side. Well, their scales don't make any sense sometimes. They did not dig 160 meters into the ground at Turner. And so again, it's there's these little details, and when you look at it, you're like, oh, okay, soil profile, there's depths, okay, that's where it came from, blah, blah, blah. But if you stop and you think, wait a minute, that's weird. Why is it 160 meters? Is that true? And so there's lots of little things like that. And then what's that? Where's the rest of the soil profile? They shaded it out. What aren't we supposed to see in there? What's missing? There's supposedly charcoal, and it's not that white dot, because that white dot, they tell us, is where their soil samples came from. So either there's a lot of charcoal in that layer to make it completely gray, or somebody used Photoshop to hide whatever details are there. No idea. I don't know what he's hiding. I don't know what's supposed to be there, but they manipulated that image for some reason. This is my favorite soil profile. Anybody ever seen the poster for the soil orders? Well, that's may even be where these images come from, as far as I can tell, because that's not an actual soil profile. Those are just sediment thrown together and photographed. And so it's, you know, is it representative? Did they forget to take photos when they were out in the field? Did they not have any records of what that soil profile looked like? They're actually, and that one is very problematic. We don't really know from the article itself where that actually came from. The coordinates are about 2 miles away from the site that they actually sampled. And so not sure what was going on there. But there is actually a mound reported about 2 miles, 2.5 miles away from there. And that's possibly where some of the materials that they mention in their supplemental material that have Hopewell diagnostics comes from, because the only report from the Indian Fork Mountain site that was done didn't find all those artifacts listed there. But an earlier survey did a wider, just like a lot of the early surveys, going out, interviewing collectors, digging at some sites, doing some surface collections. There was a mound that people had excavated into, and there was a large elaborate burial with lots of Adena Hopewell-ish grave goods. And that's the only place that we could figure out that those kinds of artifacts listed in the supplemental material came from, 2 miles away from the site where they took their samples from. And so they're conflating a lot of archaeological contexts. And you know, well, the retraction kind of hides that, but you know, it's like charcoal. Well, okay, maybe, I don't know. Maybe those are roots. It's only 40 centimeters down. I don't know what that is. I can't really tell. And so once you get past the initial overview of it, all of the details kind of like just start to scatter. And you know, this is one thing that how many of you regularly use a scanning electron microscope? How many of you know what you can do with a scanning electron microscope? And you know, so most of us archaeologists don't have this in our skill set, and so they throw these out here. There's no real explanation as to what we're saying, except for they're pallasites from meteorites. So they throw these out there, and it's like, oh, well, these are really sophisticated scientific hard science tools, right? And you know, throws out this the spectrograph of the peaks from the XRF, and you know, it's labeled, but they don't get into the details and talk about. It's like, okay, well, here's the spectra, and we say yes, it matches the one that we want it to match, but there's no spectra from that. The one that they're comparing it to is not presented, and so that's one of the things coming into it. I didn't really look at this because I knew I didn't have the information to evaluate it. But when Dr. McCoy looked at it, he noticed that the key elemental markers for the extraterrestrial materials that they claim to have found are absent. These are not extraterrestrial metals. They are terrestrial soil compounds, possibly some industrial pollution in some cases, lots of other possibilities. But with the details that we have, all we can say is that they don't fit the actually documented known examples of the type of phenomena that they claim to have found. And again, I mean, my first thought when I saw these, not knowing a whole lot about what soils look like under scanning electron microscopy, well, it's just little clay particles, clay, round, small particles. And so there are lots of round particles that are in there. There's nothing in this image that really tells us that they are made of the things that they say they are. And they don't go into any of those details in their methods in the supplemental material either. Yeah.
Is it normal to list that they use PowerPoint to make the people normally put that in there?
You guys do that in your figures? Figure made by
It just seems kind of odd.
16.41. But that's again, that's a ridiculous detail.
Yeah.
Why?
I've seen where people will mention the supplemental materials, if there's a PowerPoint that can be downloaded with images, they'll mention that it was created, but not in the article.
It's like in every one of those.
Yeah, every single one of them, there were figures created by Kenneth Barnett Tankersley and Microsoft PowerPoint for Mac version 16.41 with the link to Microsoft.com.
So if they use a different version, they wouldn't get those same figures. I don't know what they're trying to say there.
Yeah, I mean, that would make sense for something like this. Which version of the software to process the reflections did you use? What statistics did you apply to that? In which version of SPSS or whatever? That makes sense. This is irrelevant. Those pictures came from something else. And anybody can put together something in PowerPoint, which is also why we end up with things like this. Doing this manually, typing these in. I mean, presumably he was there, and it's us, but he's the one who made it, and he knows the difference between a centimeter and a meter, and so why? The hard coding all of these little details into PowerPoint is, well, for one, it's just like the least efficient way to do it. There are other ways to make an illustrated soil profile where you're not manually typing into individually positioned text boxes in PowerPoint. And also, with that, we also can't really be sure about the scale in there because these are likely PowerPoint text boxes that they're manually moving around. There are no independent markers on here that tell us what that is. So we don't even have a way to evaluate whether or not the scales in those photos are correct unless we go to the original reports where they exist and are accessible. And for Jennison Guard, they are accessible. They aren't very thorough. And there's a lot of information missing from there. But that's right. You had another question, bro? Anybody? Yeah.
Would that be attached to a retracted article like this, like part of your reputation?
Hopefully. But I mean, in this particular case, it doesn't really seem to be slowing them down. He has already, since the retraction, published about another comet that supposedly exploded over a late archaic site in Kentucky that was never again occupied, and it was because the comet exploded there. but they're using these exact same things. They're saying that they're finding these exact same things in that case. I haven't dug through all the details in that paper, so maybe some of them are legitimate, but it's the same data that's being, same kinds of data, same methods that are being piled together to make this illusion of a coherent story.
Have you seen the article published in Syria about Syria, about the economy probably over Syria?
The Talamine paper. There are a lot of those, and there are people that are actually trying to work to get that the Talamine paper retracted as well, but they've been working a lot longer than we have. And the thing about this is, to go back to one of the first questions is, what do you start looking for? Well, this is Tankersley is a member of the Comet Research Group, and the Comet Research Group is the one that's publishing all of these things. You hear about something from space coming and exploding and causing all of human history. It's probably from the Comet Research Group. It's in the name of the group. They have their conclusion before they start. They're a handler, and everywhere they go, they're finding nails. And they're just beating it over and over and over again. And it's the same thing. I mean, some of them have more explanation for their hard science methods and more details than that. But that's all they're doing. And they do fundraisers, and they like the last time I bothered to look, they raised some ridiculously large amount of money in a 2-week campaign to keep doing things like this. So it is possible for comets, meteorites large enough to damage things, to make it through the atmosphere, and to have impacts. But it certainly isn't everywhere you put a shovel in the ground.
So that was actually part of my question is, do they actually supply the information on your page on how these comets just explode out of nowhere? Because comets, asteroids, meteorites, they don't just explode out of nowhere.
Well, I mean, that is a phenomenon. Like Tunguska, the object exploded before it hit the ground, and so it was like setting off a massive bomb just above the Earth's surface. So they're claiming that this and the other one that he's talking about.
Atmosphere reacts with compounds in the asteroids to create that explosion.
Yeah.
But that doesn't always happen because you don't always have these compounds in every single asteroid or near Earth object as well.
Yep, but every single one that they think they find has the characters.
Because Southwestern and Ohio already has a known impact crater, wouldn't that taint any kind of evidence of wind crime? Because if you already have that evidence of an impact, it's something about it.
I mean, that's possible. That's also well outside my expertise and how that those the elemental rain and the sediment rain that would come out of that, how accessible that is at the surface. I don't know. So that could be, because that's quite cold. And so that could be buried under, all of the glacial waves coming through. So that I don't know, but yes, that is possible. And I actually had somebody contact me that lives near Cincinnati and said, there was something around here, and they said that they had meteorite samples that they collected around there, and that they had given some to Tankersley. So yes, these kinds of things happen. The evidence of them is out there, and so it just isn't here at this time causing the effects that they say they are. Somebody else did it.
You want to open up the questions? Let me know when you open up the questions on the Zoom.
Yeah, we could do, I was trying to find, there's a particular one of these graphs, I didn't notice it actually until I got a hold of one of the other, technical reports. It's a loose term, one of these graphs for, the Miami Port site, they actually flipped two of their samples, in the graph. It's actually correct, at least assuming that the original technical report is correct. The supplemental material gives the values at the same depth as the technical report, but the two middle samples are actually flipped so that the curves on both of those elements actually match up. That's the higher value. It might be this one. Yeah. Yes, it is this one. And so their 38 centimeter sample was actually lower than their 50 whatever centimeter sample in the data that they present in the tables and supplemental material, but that would put your peak here instead of it lines up with that. But again, it's like for this one, anytime you start scratching at the surface of any of these details, they seem to unravel. Yeah, if there's are there any questions?
So suppose there's an article like this that's been through the process and somehow passed and you realize these inconsistencies, how would you go about reporting it?
Well, I mean, maybe this isn't the best example. The first thing I did was complain on Facebook about it. I didn't, somebody posted something about it and I saw it and I was like, that's just, there's no way that's true. And so I started reading it and then just each little thing that caught my attention, I put out something on Facebook and people would respond back. And then I had several different archaeologists that were all saying, oh yeah, and agreeing and being interested in looking into it. And so I just said, all right, well, I think we need to do something about this. And so anybody that's interested, email me and we'll put together a group and we'll figure out how to address it.
I was just gonna say, a lot of times when you reach out to an editor of a journal, the original authors may recognize, oh, that was an omission or that was indeed a mistake, and they publish an erratum, which is a correction to their, it doesn't necessarily result in a retraction. Or retraction is like when pretty much the data and the conclusions are both so incredibly flawed that it shouldn't have been published in the first place. So there's differences. It depends on what you're talking about. But the other thing I was going to say, and rightly kind of pointed out, when you see figures that don't have scales, like a figure with a scale, that is data, right? When you have a scale, an appropriate scale, it's data on a map. Assuming your scale is precise, it's data. And so the data is missing from almost all those graphics that you're pointing out. It's really pretty awful.
But I mean, it would also depend on, I mean, because we're all people, right? We're not robots doing this. And so you have relationships with people. So there's somebody that you know, or that you know either closely or not, and you may know how to approach them. I mean, in this case, I do not know the lead author on a personal level. I know of them, and I know lots of people who do. And so it's my judgment that contacting him directly wasn't going to be useful. And so then reaching out to the editor and you know, pointing those things out. And in this case, it's a large interdisciplinary journal. I forget the managing editor that we have, I forget what his specialty is, but it's nowhere near astrophysics or archaeology. So he doesn't know the background in any of these things. So he's depending on the peer reviewers that they sent it to provide that expertise. And in this journal, most of the editorial board members are hard science, biological, chemistry, physics folks, and so they, you know, some of them will know about, the astrophysics and the geochemistry, but not so much the archaeology. And so that's and a lot of, interestingly enough, with no social science expertise on the editorial board, the Common Research Group uses this journal, Scientific Reports, to push out most of their things. And the idea behind the journal, I think, is actually really good. It's it may not be a Nature article or a science article, but we want raw data. We want these small little things as you're building up your argument over time. Put that stuff out there. It provides a fast, supposedly fast mechanism for getting new information out on a broad scale. Because this isn't even, they don't publish a print version. It only exists online. So nobody gets this delivered to their home unless they print it out at work and have somebody bring it to them. And so that is a good idea, and that it's open access so that people who aren't specialists can look at some of the raw data. But then it's also a problem if their process of evaluation isn't very rigorous, which at least in this case it was not. That people accessing that easily for free that don't know the background of it, then it just spreads like wildfire. And surprisingly, we did get some press with the rebuttal and then with the retraction, but nowhere near the coverage that the original very, very sensational claim got. I mean, it was all over the place. Smithsonian Magazine actually promoted it. The Archaeological Conservancy shared it out on their websites. And there were even some archaeology groups that are mostly professional archaeologists on social media that were sharing it out as, oh, look at this recent article. And it was like, no. And so, it's difficult once it gets out there to really walk back all of the effects of it. And so this is still, and probably less than half of the people who saw coverage of the original paper have seen coverage of the fact that it is no longer supported by the journal that published it, and that there was a rebuttal that was published. So that's out there. They can still become a research group and still claim that as a win. So any other?
I've got a question for Eric. Will you speak to the broader issue of how articles such as this one damage the credibility of other researchers in the field? Or is this rare enough that this could be considered an oddity and, as we were illustrating, a teachable moment?
I think that things like this, especially the sensational things, one of the opening lines that we say is like, there have been 200 years of Hopewell archaeology. And 200 years ago, it kind of just looked like a bunch of guys in wool hats going around and collecting bodies and grave goods from mounds. But nobody has ever encountered anything of a large, catastrophically burned surface. And they just keep repeating that phrase. Burned habitation surface. Catastrophically burned habitation surface. But they're just that small phrase. There's several issues with it. None of, with one exception, I think, none of the places that they're actually doing their work are places where people were living. They're the ceremonial sites. And so, what are these burned surfaces at ceremonial sites? Anybody you guys know anything about Hopewell? So, and almost all, at least in Ohio Hopewell, almost all of the large mound groups, there are several large clay platforms that they built. They sifted the soil to get the right soil texture that they wanted. They made large clay platforms, and then they put a bunch of stuff on it, and then they put a bunch of wood on it, and then they lit it all on fire repeatedly. And that's, we know that. We know that those are intentional fires that they set repeatedly. and some of those are crematory fires for ancestors. Some of them are just artifacts that are being burned. I mean, in Mound 25 at the Hopewell group, there's like 500 pounds of melted copper artifacts that came out of the two altars in that mound. That's not a habitation church. That's not somebody's house that was burned down. And so we know why those surfaces are burnt. I'm getting away from the question you asked, but so why is it bad for archaeology? Why is it bad for the public? It's because it makes it seem like that these answers are fast and quick, and that and you know, if they get attention, it sucks the oxygen out of the room when anybody else is trying to talk about actual archaeological findings. And in this in particular, and this was primarily contributed by Dr. Laura Murphy, and one of the things that she kept saying is that, you know, it takes away the agency from the people that were studying. And so they didn't have their own reasons for starting mound building and having these massive ceremonial centers where people from over half the continent are coming and gathering periodically. No, they had to have some help from space, inanimate space objects, to be inspired to do things, and that they couldn't have chosen to stop doing something or to change the way that they did their food, change the places that they live, change how they do their ceremonies on their own. They had to be bombarded from the sky out of what they were doing. They don't have any agency. And so it really removes people from the decision-making process of people. And so that's, you know, defaulting to that isn't, well, it would be difficult to characterize that as anthropology. It may still be like that.
Let me see, it was something like the comment research group counterintuitive archaeology. It's like they're looking for evidence to match the theory rather than.
I mean, it's not just counter to archaeology, it's counter to how any real research should go. You don't start with a conclusion and a battery of methods, and then every place you go, you have that conclusion, and then you use your methods that you've already determined that you're going to use everywhere. That's not how you do that. I mean, when do you use the same methods regardless of where you are, regardless of what you expect to find? Well, that's if you're doing a systematic random survey. And so if you have a regular sampling grid and you're trying to map the distribution of a thing, which is also something they did not do. We have no off-site samples here. If you've ever done anything with soil chemistry, and particularly in archaeology, you have to know what's the background. How do we know that these are different? There's one sample location at every one of these sites. They took one soil, one, and it's in the area where they think the features that they want are. There's no offsite, so we have no idea what's the background contribution, what's the signal, what's the noise. We can't filter that out because we only have one sample. And I forget where I started.
Well, were they somehow restricted on only taking one sample because of whoever the owner or caretaker of the site says you can only take one sample?
In some cases, that would probably be the case, because you know, some of these are state properties, some of these are county properties and county parks, so you know, all of the ones on public property in Ohio would have required by state law a permit from the Ohio SHPO's office to do any destructive field work out there. That's all I'm gonna say about that.
Yeah, not because you don't have access to the samples, you mean that you can just came up with assumptions just for not having the samples.
Yeah.
You know, that's not an explanation.
Yeah, you can't make the interpretation you would make if you had an adequate sample. It's just because you were procedurally or logistically limited in getting the necessary samples. So, but I mean, it's just there are this particular. There are just so many issues with it. It's difficult to. I mean, the hardest part was actually to get to this. Then first they told us we had 1,200 words and could only cite 15 sources. And so figuring out how you get all of this, which I've been talking for 50 minutes and haven't probably covered half of it, into 1,200 words, that was very difficult. So we could only really talk about a couple of the sites, the most egregious examples, well, most egregious, and one of them was also very central to their argument. So
it seems to me that one of the things that we've done is including many different forms of broad information, so that the peer reviewers were kind of overwhelmed and weren't qualified, like they didn't send it out. So typically these journals are sending things out to,
just two, and then
it's not nearly enough for something like this.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, when I've had articles that have been reviewed by 9, that makes me like this.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the very fact that they had so many disparate forms of information that they're including, there's not going to be 2 individuals that could possibly scrutinize and know the weaknesses of the different. Maybe they have their specialty. Maybe they could evaluate certain kinds of information in this paper, but not all of the different kinds, and that's problematic. That's always problematic.
Well, and I mean, it's also, I mean, it's flip-flop. Just constantly throwing things at you nonstop. They're just pelting us with all of this showy, bright information that we may not necessarily have the expertise to understand. And it's just like we're being overwhelmed with all of these new things. And so it follows the flow of how you, I mean, in that way, I mean, I can't speak to the motivations, but it comes across as very skillfully executed in the construction of the article, because when you look behind the curtain, there's nothing actually there, but it looks good on the surface. And so it's close enough to something that's real that if that's not your field, you don't notice. And so most of the people reading it aren't going to be, just like the reviewers, aren't going to be experts in each one of these different things. And so like, I don't know what to do with that. I don't know. I don't, I mean, I do some geochemistry, but I don't do anything with platinum and iridium. So I have no
One of the
idea.
big red flags that you pointed out that always gets me going is when they're not engaging with the literature, like fully, like possible critiques or counter evidence, why what you're presenting addresses that, or might, the counter arguments might not be relevant, and not engaging in that. I understand the word limitations, but not engaging in that is to me just always before scholarship.
Well, and I mean, there's the scale on some of the images being off, samples being switched in location, but even in the supplemental materials, in the stuff that they're pulling together, they've got like the soil descriptions, and then the breaking it into layers of where the artifacts came from, where their samples came from. Well, for some sites, they have the layers that they define have different depths. And I mean, there was one that even we got in the PowerPoint, so I'll just go to that. Oh, well, yeah, I mean, they same layer, they're reporting it as having different dates. Like they're not even consistent within that. And then, well, yeah, this is the one, that's where their coordinates in the supplemental material for Indian Fort Mountain shows up and their samples actually from there. But even in that case, it's not on the wall that was an embankment wall that was previously mapped and excavated. It's inside of it. And so then they're claiming, so you've got this artificial construction here, and then inside of that, you have soil of a different formation history, natural formation, and you test there, and that's where you find the evidence that you claim is associated with the construction of this embankment. Like that embankment's still there. Why didn't they test the embankment? I don't know. But this is the original soil profile from the excavation in the 80s for that. And this is the table that they published describing their soil. And so here is 7, 7 to 7, 7 to 9. What? How many 7 centimeters can they have? I don't know. But you know, none of the because we didn't know exactly from the article where that was, we were trying to see if we could match this to the profiles that were published, and then we got information independent information from somebody, archaeologist that supervises that site that was out there when they took their sample. So from personal communication with her, we know that it wasn't in this wall, but it's not. They're describing something that's not the features that were previously documented. Their 7 centimeters on their ruler moves around a lot. So, you know, it's just even basic thing. This is like, so this is supposed to be their primary data. This is supplemental material. They're like, all data used in this paper is in the supplemental material. But what is that? That's not, those are clearly not field observations. That's not possible. They didn't do that. But what is it? Why is it even there?
It almost feels like, because all of this space with Microsoft, they had an intern who's actually creating all this information.
I mean, it could be, and some of the. I wouldn't necessarily. I already support that claim. But I mean, that is possible, and one of the issues is, you know, some of the co-authors on the paper were undergraduate and graduate students who worked in the field with him and in the lab with him, and so, but still, and I worked with a lot of undergraduate students in the lab, and when they put data tables together, I checked them and make sure that they don't have duplicate information on the scale.
Like that image you have right there. Looks to me like a placeholder. Someone put there the placeholder that they put the soil profile here, and then they forgot to go back and put the actual soil thing in, and no one noticed it.
Well, but in this case, I'm pretty sure that that only did their soil. They didn't do an exploratory trench at this site, so they don't have their own excavation profile that they can photograph, and so then it's like, okay, well then they get their soil boring out, and then they spread it out on the table, and then they made their measurements, and you can do that. You can reconstruct the soil profile. And so at first I was like, okay, well maybe these are actual pictures of the soil there, but that doesn't look like pendulum. Well, that's not pink.
It feels like they don't have a one cell.
No, those don't match either. So, you know, I actually haven't gone back and checked, but I actually suspect it's from the soil orders poster. But somebody can fact check me on that one. So it's just like all of these details just don't, it's like you throw it out there and try to overwhelm you with it. But when you scratch the surface, there's nothing behind it.
Are there any more questions from the Zoom?
You can ask them if they have any questions.
You guys have any questions out there?
Just real quick, and then we're gonna have to wrap it up. I know there's a class in here afterwards. Yeah, so we're gonna. You can plug your research and where to find it. If you want to.
Well, if there's no more questions, I do have copies here for people that are here of our rebuttal. The PowerPoint presentation that we gave in spring of 2022 is there's a video of that on the OAC's YouTube page, so you can see the original presentation, and I've got some other things here that if you're interested in Ohio archaeology, some things that we've published and presented over the last couple of years out of the lab, not necessarily to do with this.
I've got a question. This is from Heather Miller. She said, as a state institution, we have a legal responsibility to provide researchers with access to information like pictures, maps, and other research tools to academics to support their research. Do you have tips or tools to help us be more aware of scholars who are releasing misinformation like this, and any tips or tools you can suggest to help us not provide bad academics for this type of material?
I mean, other than having like a review committee for data requests, and developing standards for qualifications, it's but it's also, we need state agencies also to enforce their regulations. In Indiana, it is illegal to dig with the purpose of finding artifacts without a permit issued by the SHPO's office, the Division of Historic Preservation and Archaeology. The work that Tankersley did, the first excavation, at least that they did out there, they didn't have a permit. And somebody reported it, and so they went out there, and he didn't get kicked off of the qualified professionals list. He was allowed to given a permit for the next year and for the next year to go back out to that site, even though he hadn't done that. There are more potential issues just like that at other sites, and that's as much as I should say right now.
Just a little bit more from her. She had reached out to me. She works at the Illinois State Museum and had a request from Mr. Tankersley to use some photos from their collection, and they didn't feel like he should have access to it. We just wanted to hear more about how you
Yeah, I mean,
your experience.
yeah, I mean, just develop internal standards for how you decide those things and stick to them, because people will push and getting my sticky character stuff. Can't say everything that I know at the moment.
What is Tankersley affiliation?
He has apparently a joint appointment in geology and anthropology at the University of Cincinnati. And he is, as far as I know, tenured full professor. And
If I'm not mistaken, not the Catholic first, but used to be CRA.
he worked in the Glenn Black lab at IU. I don't know his CRM history, but he went around a bunch of different universities in the Ohio Valley. He was at Kent State, I think Eastern Kentucky, and another university in Kentucky before he got to Cincinnati. But each one of those stints lasted approximately 4 years. So you guys might know why he was moving.
They have to wrap it up.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming and for having me here and allowing me to talk about this in a different audience. Appreciate it.